Oh, hello, hello. Oh, and I believe I'm live. Let's double check as always. Yesterday I had some issues. Well, it's Facebook had some issues. They always like to change some things, but hopefully today will be good. I'm just waiting for some notifications, but I see already I've got lots of people. Hello, hello. It's wonderful to see you all today. Ooh, a question right away. I need to work at 2 Central. How can I get a link to watch later? Oh, easily. You can go to the Janome HQ YouTube channel or Janome America YouTube channel. This presentation streams live there, so you can watch at any time as convenient. Now, again, Facebook is changing some things, but you should be able to scroll back in the feed. It says I'm live on Janome Canada Facebook. You're my witness. Yesterday it said I was live, and then it didn't show up in the feed. So I did post yesterday's live in our Janome Canada feed. Janome America had a similar issue where I thought I was live on their Janome Sewing Machines Facebook page. So instead they posted a link to their YouTube channel, Janome America YouTube. So you can go back to review these presentations on Janome America YouTube or Janome HQ YouTube. That's our Janome Canada YouTube channel. Or again, that you should be able to go back to the respective Janome Sewing Machines Facebook page or Janome Canada Facebook page that should be in the feed or the videos tab. But again, Facebook likes to change things, so that's why we're streaming live to YouTube as well, because not everybody is Facebook. So hello, everyone. Yes, my sister Deb is here, and Jackie is here, and Diana's here. Hello, hello. Oh, from a sunny day in Tennessee. Lovely. It's a beautiful day here at my palatial estate in Collingwood. So thank you, everyone, for joining me today. My name is Michael Smith, the National Education Manager of Janome Canada, and I'm back live to share with you some little tips and tricks. March is National Quilting Month. So some more little quilting tips and tricks, specifically about our 1/4 of an inch. That's the traditional seam allowance used in quilt making, in piecing together a quilt. And sometimes, people really struggle to get that perfect 1/4 of an inch. And sometimes, we need to use a little less and a little bigger. So we'll go over all of that. As usual, time will fly by. So let me flip around and boom, share with you my beautiful Skyline S7 AE Anniversary Edition. They revamped to celebrate the 10 years of the Skyline line. There's a Skyline S3, S5, S6, S7, and there is a Skyline S9. Now, Skyline S9, that is sewing and embroidery, did not get a redo. They've already updated that machine a couple of times, but all the other Skylines got updated with this beautiful accent here of this midnight blue, as they call it, and slightly different shape as well. They redid the body shape, and Skyline S7 AE has lots of new additional capabilities of the machine. So again, double check with your Janome dealers if you're in the line for a new machine. Particularly in March, we've got the Lucky Offers promotion going on, both in Canada and the States. So great time to get a new machine or maybe some fabulous new accessories. For example, as we're talking about our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, there are many ways we can achieve that depending on your machine. That sometimes we can move the needle position over from center needle position. Some machines have a dedicated piecing stitch, for example. So here I have center needle position, and on my Skyline S7, for example, I can go into my quilting decorative stitch category, quilting category, boom, stitch number 2, my 1/4 of an inch P, that's piecing stitch. And automatically you'll see, again, why do we spend a little more on our machines? Well, look at this beautiful LCD screen, and we have these push button capabilities where all I do is select that stitch and my machine has done the work for me. The needle position has moved over to the right. You can see here as represented on the LCD screen. It recommends I use the foot, the 1/4 inch foot. In this case, it has a guide and some convenient 1/4 inch markings here. And then again, it has moved my needle over to the right, and then it's shortened my stitch length to 1.8. So it's a nice tight stitch. We don't have to worry about the seams coming apart, back stitching or anything. That holds together quite nicely. So again, I always love to do little test samples on your scraps of fabric, and I write there was 8.3 width and 1.8 length. So when we go to double check this 1/4 inch seam allowance, we could use one of the old quilting gauges that I've had forever. And of course, I can't find it right now on my sewing table. But little rulers, whatever you need to use. I love my Quilt in a Day ruler in particular because it's got this 1/4 inch line all around it. So we can do our little test sample and then lay the ruler up against, I'll do that, lay the ruler up so my stitching is right on that 1/4 inch line. And you'll see the edges of my fabric are right along the edge of that ruler. Like that is the perfect 1/4 inch. It worked out beautifully. Now, how we can double check. Now, as a regular 1/4 inch seam, like that's fine. So there are times we use 1/4 inch in garment sewing, in making our tote bags, our home decor, so 1/4 inch seam is fine. Where we sometimes get some issues is when we have a block with multiple seams. Look at this. I have a 1/4 inch seam here, 1/4 inch seam here, 1/4 inch seam there, another 1/4 inch there, and another 1/4 inch there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seams. So we need our 1/4 inch seam to be very accurate in this case because we need this block to finish a particular size. So if we're just sewing, again, a regular 1/4 inch seam for, a pocket and we're flipping it inside out, or again, for one block as a 1/4 inch seam, fine. But maybe we need to make some adjustments to our 1/4 inch seam line when we have all of these seams. So there's many things I'm going to go over today. So again, for our 1/4 inch, typically, again, we can use our center needle position, and we do have many convenient markings on our patented needle plate. Now, the Janome Skyline S7AE comes with the zigzag needle plates on my machine. Here is the straight stitch needle plate, which we ultimately recommend for piecing. But here we have, again, that horizontal line is where we're going to be lining up our fabric. But you see here, we have a 1/4 inch line right up here on the needle plate. Up here on the bobbin cover, in between 1/8 and 3/8 is 1/4. There's another tick mark there at 1/4, and there's another tick mark here at 1/4. There's ultimately another 1/4 inch right up here. So there's 5 1/4 inch markings on our patented needle plate here. Now, many of our Janome machines, again, have various markings of the needle plate. But something you could use as well if you're not going to follow the guide of your needle plate. Maybe you have a cloth guide. There is a screw-in metal cloth guide that you can get in a blister pack. And you could line up, if you don't have the marks on your needle plate to follow, you could move that cloth guide up to a 1/4 inch, measure over from center needle position, lock your cloth guide into place. It just screws into the threaded screw hole of your needle plate, or some machines it screws into the plastic housing of the machine. Other machines here, like again, Skyline S7, there's a notch in the back of my extension table. There is a big plastic cloth guide that will slide along the bed of the machine with a long fence, and we could line it up with the 1/4 inch marks of our needle plate, or again, measure over from center needle position to find that 1/4 inch, lock that cloth guide in place, and do all of our piecing, no problem. Now, again, since I have the capability of just using that dedicated 1/4 inch seam built into my Skyline S7 here, I'll snap on my O-foot with the guide. Now, in a blister pack, we could also get a 1/4 inch foot with no guide. Sometimes it's very handy to use the guide. Other times people don't like that guide. So this is available separately in a blister pack, or for the Skyline S7 AE. I've showed this on some of my other lives. We have the optional Skyline S7 AE Advanced Accessory Kit. And it has things like, the HP needle plate and HP foot, which I will talk about in just a minute. That perfect 1/4 inch. There is the O foot with no guide. There is the ruler foot. There's the variable zigzag foot and the open toe PDH darning foot. All of these feet, for example, I have demoed on the A to Z with Janome series on Janome HQ YouTube. So check those out. Also check our Janome Life blog for lots of information about various pressure feet. So again, now I'm going to change my foot and use that dedicated 1/4 inch stitch. And again, my machine is helping me by saying, oh yes, use that O foot. Now again, normally I would switch my needle plate to center needle, or to that straight stitch needle plate is what we recommend for piecing because of that center hole, and we don't have to worry about our needle, punching our fabric down in that zigzag needle plate. So normally we would switch that out. It's perfectly fine that I'm going to stay in this position since I'm going to do a couple of things here to adjust my needle. So when we want to test our piecing, though, to make sure we are accurate, I always recommend I cut 3 strips here, 2 inch each, 2 inch wide strips. So we do this little test sewing. So when I put my strip here and my foot down, do you see this is a snap-on foot? And there is a little wiggle room to this foot, which is fine. That's normal. What I like to do when I drop my foot, though, and I line up my fabric here with the marks on my needle plate. So I just give that foot a little nudge back over to my fabric. Again, nothing is wrong with the foot. That's just the way snap-on feet work. But I just give it a little snug back over. So I do my seam here. I'm keeping my fabric aligned with that guide. Personally, I love feet with a guide because I generally sew kind of fast. So then we put our another piece of fabric here. And this is, to me, the most accurate way. Now, yes, I could line up my ruler and line it up. Here's my 1/4 inch line, and I could line up my ruler with the needle, and does it, intersect with that? Does it butt up against that guide? So I could check my seam allowance that way, but I always rather do it in fabric first. And again, I've got these very handy, helpful guides out here before I get to my foot. That's where, again, the metal cloth guide that screws into your needle plate, or again, the other big cloth guide. Many of our machines either come with a cloth guide or there's one available separately. So check with your dealer. They really do help. Now, pressing is definitely going to also influence the accuracy of our seam allowance. So as I do my stitching here, if my hand were the iron, I would press. I'm not going to iron back and forth. I'm just going to press. I'm going to set my seam, press it the way I sewed it, just to set it. Allows the fabric to relax a little bit. It helps kind of embed that thread into the fabric. And then when I go to fold this over, we're typically pressing to the dark side. Not always, but in general. So to open this up, though, I think of this like a little hinge. And if my finger were the iron, I'm just getting in the tip of the iron right in this seam. I don't really want to mash this out too much because then I can really stretch and distort my fabric. So I just use the tip of the iron, or again, we've got little wooden irons that'll do exactly the same thing. Or again, use your finger, use your nail, to help crease that open. And I do the same here. Set the seam the way it was sewn, and then use the tip of the iron just in this well of the seam to open it and lay it out flat. So I have 2 inches, 2 inches, 2 inches. That would be 6 inches. But I've minused 1/4 of an inch from this piece and 1/4 of an inch from that piece. So that's 1/2 of an inch. And then on this side, I also minused another 1/4 of an inch and another 1/4 of an inch. So I've removed a total of 1 inch. So when I lay my ruler back on this piece of fabric, it should measure 5 inches. And look how perfect that is. One would think I've been quilting for 33 years, which I have. But yes, look, that is absolutely perfect. So that's what we want to do to check our seam. Is it perfect? That's perfect. So again, practice, as we say, practice makes perfect. But that's, to me, the most accurate way. You cut your little pieces of fabric and you sew. And again, we use the marks on our needle plates. If you don't have that, even green painter's tape is your friend. If you must, if your needle plates aren't marked as much, if we need to, again, on these 1/4 of an inch lines, or again, where I would measure over with my ruler to give me a guide, then I could lay the green painter's tape and just follow that line. Something else I've recently discovered too, we have extra needle plates, for example. If I want a guide like way out here, if I don't have a guide on my foot, for example, but I want a guide out here, I've been turning my needle plates upside down, and actually I've been lining them up with the marks on my foot. And I've just been holding them in place, and then I've been butting my fabric up against the needle plate. It just acts as a perfect little guide. And again, it's upside down. If I wanted to, if I didn't want to hold it, I don't want to put the painter's tape over like any of the sensors or anything, but sort of out here in the middle, it's not going to be on top of anything. I would do that to tape it down if need be. For the most part, I just hold mine. I have very steady hands that way. Don't drink too much coffee. Just hold it down. And it works as a perfect little fence. So I always recommend the cloth guide that's compatible with your machine. But if you don't have one and you need in a pinch, turn over your needle plate, and that works out beautifully. And again, green painter's tape is your friend. You could use blue as well. But that way it's not going to mark up your needle plate. It's not going to mark up the bed of your machine. So that is one way we can get an accurate 1/4 of an inch. Now, Janome also has special feet depending on your machine. This is a clear view 1/4 of an inch foot. Now this, we're going to use center needle position. Then we don't have to worry about, does my machine have a dedicated stitch? I can go right back to my regular utility straight stitch. We know all machines have that. Since I'm doing my piecing, again, I like to shorten my stitch length to 1.8 personally, but you can stitch ultimately whatever seam allowance you like, or whatever stitch length. The reason behind that shorter stitch is we will often cut apart after I do my, piecing here. We'll often cut apart these units there, and so I don't have to worry about this stitch coming unraveled, and we don't have to worry about back stitching and lock stitching. That's just going to do a big buildup of thread. So by having that shorter stitch length in the first place, it's just a little more secure. So in this place, I'm using my center needle position. And again, we would typically recommend the straight stitch needle plate with this. But you'll see it works perfectly fine with the zigzag as well. But with this foot, it's the clear view 1/4 of an inch seam foot. It is compatible with straight stitch needle plate. That's the center needle position. And it is for 9 millimeters only. Any of your 9 millimeter snap-on feet will work. You'll see, again, there's a little bit of wiggle room in here, which is fine. And when I do my, it's just a little bit, it's not significant. But again, whoops, where I put my pieces here, I always love to nest my seams when I can. One seam is going down, one seam is going up, and they just lock together or kiss or nest, whatever you'd like to call it. But yes, when I lined this up, again, it's got this wonderful long guide, so we can get that accurate 1/4 of an inch piecing. And again, when I do my snap-in feet, I just give the tip of my foot just a little nudge to the left, just to line it up again perfectly to those marks on the needle plate. And again, I like holding down my seam allowance so it doesn't flip over. And then boom, again, a nice long fence. So we would just butt one piece after another after another. This is where, again, I could get all my sewing done if I didn't have to worry about the pressures of live and time restrictions. And again, it just works out so beautifully. So there is either feet that come with your machine, or again, beautiful as my 1/4 of an inch there. Look at that beautiful match. And again, I could use my ruler and line it up there perfectly. It lines up perfectly. So we could get a foot like this 1/4 of an inch clear view foot. We can see right through it. There's other handy registration marks there too. Or we also have, this is a multi-purpose foot, is the Clear View Foot and Quilting Guide Set. It's in 9mm and 7mm. This not only has a ditch quilting guide, but then we would remove the ditch quilting guide, and here is a 1/4 of an inch guide that just screws onto the top there. So that's another 1/4 of an inch foot we could use. The Clearview Quilting Foot and Guide Set, available from your Janome dealer. So see what they have available. Now, when I mentioned, so that's our perfect 1/4 of an inch, but oh, what about this block with multiple seams? When I measured, this block should finish 6.5 inches. And when I measured this block after using that 8.3 seam allowance, do you see this should finish 6.5? This only finished at 6, and it was what, 6 1/4, 6 3/8. So this is just an 1/8 of an inch too small, because again, all those extra seams, the fabric, eats up every time we turn the fabric right side out, that it eats up a little bit of the fabric, or it eats up a little bit of that seam allowance. So instead of using that regular, quilting stitch at, again, 8.3, this is where we can do that scant 1/4. And what I do on this machine, Skyline S7AE, I move my needle over, all the way over to 9.0. So that way it produces a little more, again, scant, 9.0. Now, again, there is no technical measurement for a scant. It's either a 1/4 or it's not. But in a quilter's term, it's typically 1 or 2 threads less. So when I hold up my sample here and my stitching is right on that 1/4 of an inch, it'll be hard for you to tell, but the instead of the raw edge of the fabric right against the edge of the ruler, the raw edge of the fabric is just slightly more shy of that edge. Again, it's hard for you to see on camera, but it's just slightly more shallow because that needle has moved even more to the right. So you can do your test sample, and again, it's just ever so slightly, but it will make a difference. It's about maybe 2 threads worth. Now, a thread is another thing. I'm sewing with 40 weight thread right now. The thinner your thread, that's about an average sewing thread, 40 or 50 weight thread. Thread is the higher the number, the thinner the thread, smaller the number, the thicker the thread. So most sewing thread is 40 or 50 weight thread. There is my 9.0. Do you see? That was 8.3. The red, the blue is 9.0. So you see, it's a more narrow seam allowance. So that produces, again, that scant quarter just by moving my needle position over. So we could do that, move the needle position over, or if our machine, can't let us do that, we just simply, instead of exactly at those 1/4 of an inch mark, we just move if we can't move our needle to the right, we can move our fabric to the left and reduce the width of our seam allowance. That will help give us that scant quarter. And again, there is no technical measurement for it. But when I did that on this sample, then this block finishes exactly at my there. That block finishes exactly at 6.5 inches. Because again, by the time I fold each of these fabrics out, now in this case too, pressing, I elected to press this seam open. These naturally wanted to go to one side or the other. This didn't matter. So I decided, oh, that'll be a little flatter. So I folded that over, or I pressed it open. So again, there's not as much fabric taken up there by the fold of the fabric. So this block worked out perfect at 6.5 because of that 9.0 needle position. Now, if we can't change our needle position, or even sometimes if we can, what we can also do, again, thread is very weird in that the higher the number, the thinner the thread. So this is an 80 weight thread. So in my machine, I have again, a 40 weight thread, typical sewing thread. Can you see? It's very, the color just blends right into my skin. But can you see this blue is that thicker thread? It's a 40 weight. This more tan color thread, that is the 80 weight. That's a nice fine thread. When you wind your bobbins with this 80 weight thread, you can reduce the speed. However, your machine, sometimes we can do it on the LCD screen, but when we're winding our bobbin, we can just turn our speed control slider. That'll slow down the bobbin because we don't want this very fine thread to stretch more. So slow down the speed of your bobbin winding. But using this 80 weight thread is definitely going to help make your seam allowances more true, more accurate. So if you can't change your needle position to that scant quarter, maybe just switch out your thread to a more fine thread, and then the thread won't take as much room in that seam allowance when we go to press open our fabric. Again, the thread takes up a little bit of space as well in that seam. So using the finer thread, our seams will lay a little flatter. So again, it'll be more accurate to that measurement. In my case, 6.5 inches would work out beautifully. So there's many things we could do to get that more narrow seam. Now, also, as I mentioned, some machines are compatible with that HP high performance needle plate with that left needle position and the HP foot. And that again is that perfect 1/4 of an inch. Why? This foot, look at this. There is no left and right movement of that foot because the foot and the foot holder are one unit. These feet, again, there's a little bit of wiggle room, which is perfectly fine. Nothing is wrong. You saw how accurate it is. So this foot is perfectly fine. But sometimes, again, when things are really precise, you need that scant quarter, or again, that perfect true quarter. Then a lot of us quilters love this HP foot and HP needle plate combo because, again, there's no wiggle room in that foot. It's integrated with the foot holder. Now, this HP foot and HP needle plate, as you saw, is compatible now with Skyline S7 AE. Only the anniversary edition is the HP needle plate and HP foot compatible. The original Skyline S7, it's not compatible, but it is now with the anniversary edition, and it comes in that fabulous Skyline S7 AE Advanced Accessory Kit. So again, go to Janome Life blog. There's a ton of blogs on the HP needle plate and HP foot. And again, do yourself little sample. Here is my 8.3 width and 1.8 length with 80 weight thread. And again, we just do our little test sample. And again, boom, does it turn out exactly as I need it? Yes. Now, sometimes this is actually a tiny, again, it's just a little speck bigger actually than my 5 inches. It may be hard for you to tell. It's just a little bit bigger than 5 inches. And why? Because of that thin thread. So in this case, with these 2 seams, I didn't need that thin thread. But maybe in a block with this many seams, switch to the thin thread. It'll make all the difference. Even if you can't move your needle position, it'll make a big difference. Now, there are times where we need a bigger seam allowance, not just the regular 1/4 of an inch, but when we have things like piano key borders, lots of strips sewn together. As usual, my time just flies by. Here, let's go on a little trip. This quilt, many of you have asked about this in the background. And this is a beautiful flying geese quilt that I made years ago. This is just half square triangles, but look at all this piano key borders. It's a great way to make your quilt bigger, a great way to use up all your scraps. And sometimes when we're piecing all those strips together, using our regular 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but sometimes, you know, oh, we need to maybe refine the fit of this. So by using a bigger seam allowance, a generous 1/4 of an inch. So here, for example, I stitched at 7.0, or my original here was 8.3 was the white, if you can see. The white was 8.3. But I needed to make these pieces just a little bit smaller so they would fit my quilt. So in red, my first row of stitching was at 7.7. I moved my needle position to the left this time because I wanted a bigger seam allowance. Then my next row of stitching was at 7.0. So it's a generous 1/4 of an inch. And again, we typically don't use the generous 1/4 of an inch too often, but there are some blocks that will require a slightly bigger than 1/4 of an inch seam. So again, this is using that 1/4 of an inch foot in this case, and that 1/4 of an inch stitch. But instead of the default was set at 8.3, was set at 8.3. But in this time, I want a slightly more generous seam allowance. So I move my needle to the left. So in this case, it's negative. Now, maybe we only need to move it to 8.0. That's why you do your little test sample here. Or maybe, again, as I did 7.7, and then decided, oh, maybe in this case, with this foot on, I can only go to 7.7. So we do our little test sample. And again, you'll maybe see in my thread, oops, turn my machine back up. There we go. So hopefully in the blue, you'll be able to see slightly. So when I do my piano key borders, I do exactly this. I do all my regular 1/4 of an inch, and then I pin this on and say, oh, this is a little, oh, Donna's here. Hello, hello. This is a little too big. So do you see with the blue, it's literally like 1 or 2 threads over, really, like it's not that significant. But in order to make this piece fit my quilt, moving that needle over to that generous 1/4 can make all the difference in the world. Now, again, there's no real measurement. So if I wanted, again, I can go to 7.7 with this foot. So if I wanted to go more, well, that's when I could switch back to my regular foot, and then again, I've got wider width on that foot. So then I could move, and this foot, I can't use this foot. So I could go back to my regular foot. And again, I can move my needle position over as much as I need. But typically, again, it's only a little bit to make that difference of that generous quarter. So every once in a while, your typical 1/4 of an inch will get you through most quilt making. But every once in a while, you need to adjust to make that either typically a scant quarter we would use in more instances than that generous quarter, but every once in a while, that generous quarter can make all the difference in the world, again, particularly for your piano keys. So thank you everyone so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. I will see you all next week. Have a fabulous day. Bye.